Okay, so today we are going to really start this really long section of the course that's going to be a joint history uh, and very much interconnected history between Anglo-Americans and African Americans, which are, of course, really the two largest ethnic groups and racial groups in America. Today, however, we're going to look specifically at the background, if you will, of Anglo-Americans. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that term because that term can be a little loose. And today I'm going to use it pretty much for English, a little bit for British, but in um, but the goal today is really start looking at the formation of this ethnic group, a group that we often don't even think of as an ethnic group. For a lot of people, when they just say Americans, this is really who they're talking about, Anglo-Americans. And I think a lot of people have never even really thought who are the Anglo-Americans and what comprises them. And you might be surprised that it's actually quite a number of different groups historically that melded together to become the English. Um, I did want to talk about this weird image. I know the other day in the face-to-face class, I showed the image and I didn't explain it. And I think I even heard a couple of people kind of giggling because it's a weird image once you kind of look at it. Even though slavery is not going to be on the table for this portion of the lecture, that's going to be later. Slavery obviously is going to come up. And I've mentioned the title, American Slavery, American Freedom, comes from a historian named Edmund Morgan. And this was at the time a really cutting edge book when it came out in 1976. And it's still very relevant now. I mean, it's still one of my favorite books on the topic. And he mentioned that these two very opposite ideas are actually very tightly connected. Because so many people who talked about freedom, like Jefferson and Washington and James Madison and James Monroe, and were slave owners, and that you almost can't talk about one without talking about the other because these two things very much influenced each other. And in the same way, Anglo Americans and African Americans are really, they're here almost at the exact same time. I mean, people of African heritage actually predate English when you look at Spanish America, but uh, Jamestown's founded in 1607. 1619, we get the first enslaved Africans in British America. So what we now consider the United States was developed by these two groups of people at the same time, interacting with each other and all that. So again, that hence why the title is what it is. Slavery is something, even though again it's not today's topic, but slavery is something that I think really even us historians really can't wrap our minds around because it's an alien world to us. I mean, it hasn't existed in the form we had it hasn't existed for 160 years, and I really don't think people today can really comprehend just the actual reality of what we're talking about. A human being literally owning another human being. Not that all slave systems do that. I mean, this is something that was a little bit unique to the English slave system. Something later we'll talk about the development of the idea of slaves as literal real estate, as literal property. But then again, it's such a weird idea. And kind of like sometimes the way an actor will, have a particular image in their mind to get them into character. For me, this was an image that did that. It's from a book, a guide, if you will, about how to be a slave trader. You kind of forget this was a real industry. I mean, this was a profession that people went into. And you had to know what you were doing, where to go, what to buy, what to pay for, what to look for when you were buying a person. And which is already just a weird idea, but this was an illustration showing this because one of the things, slave traders when they purchased slaves in Africa was, they want to make sure the person they're buying was skilled but also healthy. They don't want to buy, a group of people that were going to die in 2 weeks. And of course, this is pre-modern medicine. And so one of the ways they did this was what was called testing the sweat. What it really is tasting the sweat. And that's actually what's happening in this image. He's literally licking the person's chin to taste their sweat to see if they're healthy or not. And it was just such an odd idea and to see it actually, drawn out, to me is what gets me into that weird mindset of, okay, this is an alien world to, the world we live in today. Anyway, so that's that weird image since I've shown it before and haven't explained it. Okay, so let's get to who are Anglo Americans. I mean, really, who are the English? And to a large degree today, I'm going to talk about British. In fact, let me use terminology super fast. I don't have a map on the screen, but um, we tend to throw these terms around a lot. So, uh, in today's world, the United Kingdom really is comprised of two main islands. So, there's the island of Ireland, which is two countries, Ireland and Northern Ireland. And then there is the island of Britain, and of course, that's three countries: Wales, England, and Scotland. So when we talk about British people, we're talking about people from the island of Britain. And then English are obviously from England, Scottish from Scotland, Welsh from Wales. And the Irish could be from two different countries. And all that together is the United Kingdom. At one time, it was just Ireland. Now, again, it is a separate Ireland plus Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. So, again, we use these terms kind of interchangeably. Today, I'm going to talk a lot about the British, people from the British island of Britain, but more than not, more about English than Welsh or Scottish. Anyway, sorry, just wanted to, because like I said, I think most Americans, we don't really think about the differences of these terms. So, what we now call Britain, that island, you know, did have people pretty far back. Humans originated in Africa, as we know, and then 50 to 40,000 years ago, humans began to migrate out of Africa into Europe and Asia and Australia, and then ultimately North America. And so, not a huge amount of time after they leave Africa, we do see evidence of humans in what is today Britain, actually, what is today England. And the earliest evidence of human beings is somebody that was known as the Red Lady of Pavlan. It's actually a male skeleton, it turns out, an estimated about 21 years old, and dates to, 26,000 years ago. However, people today in Britain, although they do date pretty far back, would not be part of this population of humans because, as this is still the Pleistocene era, the Ice Age, and the Ice Age went back and forth. So you would have a period of glaciation, and then it would warm up, and then it would go back to be. And so soon after this, we do see the Ice Age kind of kick in again, and Britain is covered in ice, and there's no humans there. And then once that ice retreats, we do see more humans moving in. So a later population moves in. And that is where uh, the vast majority of people in Britain today, at least people whose families go back more than a couple hundred years, we're not necessarily talking about 2025, where a lot of people in Britain today would have been arrivals in the last century. But those people whose families go back, they would go back to that second population that moved in. So again, you have this period of ice age where this area is completely covered in ice, so there's no humans, and then again, it does eventually retreat. Sorry, I should have had these slides up a minute ago. And but we do see evidence of humans again a little over 10,000 years ago. And the earliest evidence of humans was in an area known as Cheddar Gorge. There were bones found, again, that date back quite a ways. The estimate originally of what the person might have looked like was, this is a reconstruction, which kind of looks like what you might imagine an early British person would look like. But of course, with DNA studies, they were able to get DNA from these bones and then estimate what the person might have looked like, both on the bone structure, but also from the DNA. And of course, every year we're refining more and more of what we can learn from DNA. This is the more recent idea of what this person may have looked like. Genetically speaking, it does look like the person would have had darker skin, and again, features that look a little less typically British. And we've talked about this already that, a lot of our racial features, these physical features that we associate with race, I mean, they're constantly in flux based on diet and based on environment and interaction with other people. So, again, these early British people may have looked quite different from the way British people look today. This person is known as Cheddar Man because of where it was found. And again, that is where we get the name cheddar for cheese. This is also cheese comes, this cheddar cheese originally came from this area. And again, dates back close to 10,000 years ago. There's evidence that it was not a nice death. To me, one of the most interesting things about this, and this starts getting into kind of the point of this lecture. Um, the BBC, helped fund the study of this. And, as part of a documentary, they decided as they were getting the DNA evidence, they thought, well, we'll go ahead and take evidence from a lot of people in this area, including a local history class, and we'll get the students. Plus, we'll get the history teacher, of course, too, just see how closely related anybody is. And the results were quite surprising in that pretty much everybody in this area was indeed related to this person. And in fact, the history teacher, who's pictured here on the front of this book, was actually a direct descendant. And and again, I think for us Americans, it really is hard to wrap our minds around this idea that, um, again, most of us in America, I mean, the vast majority of our population, couple hundred years, maybe. I mean, a few of us might go back a little bit further. But again, less than 1% of us are Native American. So again, we're not used to the idea of I live on this land and my family may have lived on this land 5, 6, 7,000 years ago. Or further back. But, again, this is why Europeans tease us for not having a history because our history, is so shallow. I mean, I think I've said this before, there are pubs older than the United States. And so again, this gets an idea of, how closely related a lot of British people really are and how closely tied they are to that area. And again, it is a tourist attraction and, they really play up Cheddar Man in this area and all that. Um, One thing I'm getting into this DNA business, because this has been really interesting for British studies and even for British identity. And in fact, DNA has kind of changed so much of how we're thinking about human populations and such. Um, and this is going to seem like maybe a kind of a slightly academic point, but of course, this is a college class. But this is kind of the point of the lecture is, who are people and identity and what do we mean by race and ethnicity and such. So, when you think, in Britain, um, for so long, people had very both in Britain and outside, there was a really strong idea of who do we mean when we talk about British people. So, first off, there was always this kind of idea that people in England were truly distinct from people in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And we tend to use the term often Celtic. And I use it colloquially myself, even though, as you saw on the other slide, I mean, academically, there's a lot of debate over this term. But there is this kind of thought of, that there were kind of the original peoples of the British Isles, and then this Celtic population moved in and kind of took over. And then you get later these Germanic peoples, these Angles and Saxons come in, and they settle in what is now England and kind of push out these Celtic peoples. And these Celtic peoples had pushed out the previous peoples, and that there's these population replacements. And again, this seems like such a minor point. Who cares? We're talking thousands of years ago. But again, when an English person or a Scottish person or a Welsh person, thinks, "Who am I?" And even how they relate to each other. And this has political repercussions. This has historical repercussions. There is a lot of people that really think like I, as a Scottish person, and I am distinctly, perhaps even racially different from an English person. And this has had huge repercussions because we will come back to this later and another part of this lecture. But like for instance, in the 17 and 1800s, there was British policy, English policy, was based on this idea. So when you talk about the clearances of the Highlands, this is where rural, poor Highlander Scots were literally removed off the land forcibly, in some cases shipped away. That was partly the justification. These are primitive Celtic peoples. These are not the real Anglo-Saxons of lowlands and of England. Or even the way the Irish were treated. I mean, there was a real racial component to that. Um, and a couple of things. One is with both archaeology, but especially with um, um DNA studies, the first off, there really isn't this huge migration of massive amounts of Celtic people replacing. In fact, we never really see this. We don't see this a whole lot in a lot of the world, but we definitely don't see this in Britain, where you see one population completely replace another population. We will see lots of migrations of people and invasions of people, and we will see that in the DNA. But we don't see one population completely get wiped out or moved off and another one replace it, and then you let it yet again replace it. Um, Going back to the 90s, when the first kind of widespread DNA studies were really being done, I mean, that was really the first decade where DNA was starting to be useful for this kind of stuff. I mean, you really do forget it wasn't until the 90s that DNA was even being used in murder trials and such. I mean, we're so used to that, we forget it's barely a generation old, and we're still. I say we like I'm doing it, but as a society, we're still constantly refining it. But those first DNA studies, kind of shocked everybody because uh, it kind of really revealed that again for those long-term families in Britain, the DNA wasn't all that different. It was pretty much the same basic DNA. I mean, obviously there's going to be regional differences and slightly different histories, but the shocking thing was, you weren't seeing a Celtic DNA in sort of say Scotland, and then this Anglo-Germanic DNA in England, and and they're totally distinct peoples. It was pretty much everybody kind of had the same DNA overwhelmingly. Again, it was a diverse DNA, but it was the same diversity for everybody. In other words, when you think of as far as DNA genetics, uh, Welsh, Scottish, English, even to a large degree, a lot of the Irish, it is, we're not really talking major, definitely not talking racial differences. And I think for us Americans, that seems weird anyway, because we do lump them all together. But this is still, I mean, this is still kind of an alive idea. And even in the US, there are people maybe who identify, say, Scotch Irish, who really think of themselves, like say in the South, that do think of themselves as distinct from those New English, Yankees, as they're from a different stock of humans. Like, no, actually, it would really be the same. So again, this whole idea of Celtic, it has real political implications, and again, in the past, it also had policy implications. But even now, when you start talking about some of these nationalist movements in Scotland or Wales, a lot of them used as Celtic past as like, we truly are different from those English people down there. We're not the same people. And it's like, well, you might say you're a different culture, but as far as that part of it's concerned, that really doesn't hold up with the DNA. And again, there's been pushback on this for a long time, but it still holds. And I'm not gonna lie, I say Celtic sometimes because it's just easy when you're referring to kind of Scottish culture, But when you do look at the DNA, and again, they're focusing this more and more over the years, so they're getting a finer and finer viewpoint of this DNA. And of course, a lot of this is coming from, 23andMe and all the Ancestry and all these different, DNA things that we're all doing, and we're all adding to this picture. There is a lot of diversity, and that makes sense because when you look at the history of British people, especially England, there has been an influx of a lot of people over a few thousand years. So you would expect the DNA to not just be one uniform DNA. So there is a lot of variety, but again, the interesting part is everybody seems to have this variety. Again, you do have evidence of those early British peoples, those original peoples going all the way back to Cheddar Man. Um, you do see people coming over from Western Europe, which would be the Angles and Saxons and later the Normans. We also see Scandinavia, which would be the Vikings. We do see Irish, which again, there was migrations of people from the island of Ireland to Scotland and England, especially Scotland. And then, Iberia and stuff. I mean, there was a Roman period. So again, this actually isn't surprising at all based on the peoples we know migrated to Britain over the period. So going back now, and I'll try to do this fairly quickly. So when you look at, these early peoples, you pretty much have the same population from Cheddar Man essentially for a long time. Culturally, they're changing and evolving, and as a non-British archaeologist, it can get quite confusing. A lot of it's based on pottery styles and things, but essentially, you're basically seeing these same people that are developing into various cultural and even linguistic groups, but really are the same people. In the same way, Native Americans are all coming from the same source, and then over time they're developing into these distinct cultures. Um, and again, we can, archaeologically, you can kind of see a lot of similarities. We have a lot of agrarian people. We have a pretty good idea of what a lot of the houses would have looked like. Scotland has actually some of the earliest sites that survive. I think the original assumption was England would have the older sites, and then Scotland would have been the area people later moved into. And actually, again, some of the earliest developed sites seem to be in northern Scotland and some of especially some of these stone traditions, and then they're moving down into England. Scarborough is one of these sites that predates the pyramids, and really quite a complex site that's still being excavated. But these idea of these stone circles, and they come in different varieties. Some are clearly calendrical, meaning calendars. Others may be evidence of a outline of an old house, maybe burials. I mean, but this whole idea of these stone circles and various stone features, we really see the earliest ones in Scotland. Again, we all think Stonehenge in England, but really Scotland seems to have been the beginning of this tradition, and then it does seem to have moved down into England over time. And again, we always just think of Stonehenge, but we forget how many of these stone circles there are of different varieties and sizes. By the way, since I do direct the Scotland Study Abroad program, we do sometimes go see a couple of the stone circles in Scotland. This is on the Isle of Arran from a few years ago. Um, and again, there's actually another early Scottish site. It's actually Dunod, which is a site where early Scottish kings were crowned, and they would actually place their foot in that footprint and then get crowned to connect them from the crown literally to the ground of Scotland. Anyway, and that's my son years ago in England at one of these stone circles. Anyway, so sorry, I just have a bunch of these images. And again, there's real quick, there's a lot of we really don't know a lot about these sites, and despite all the studying, I mean, they are mostly just stones. So sometimes there are burials associated. Sometimes there are. Stonehenge itself is actually a massive complex. It's not just a stone circle. But again, there's a lot of kind of myths about what might have happened there. There's a lot of New Age or neo-pagan religions that do claim Stonehenge as a sacred site. Of course, there's movies, Wicker Man and things of that nature. A lot of speculation, but much of it is just speculation. We really don't know as much as people think we might know of these sites. Um, we do have other evidence of some of these early peoples in Britain. We have things like Lindau Man, which was basically what you might know as a bodies that was fairly well preserved in these peaty kind of mucky sites. We see a lot of these in Scandinavia. So there, we do have some insights into some of these early peoples. And then of course, the next big step, if you will, is this Roman period. And I think people really do forget how much the Romans played a role in Britain, including why we call it Britain, but especially in the southern England section. This is again from one of these Roman sites. You can see the tile floor and such. I mean, I think a lot of people would be shocked if they realized how much evidence there was for the Romans here. I mean, we first see Julius Caesar come in 55 BC. Uh, and then a little bit later, under Claudius, we do actually see the conquering and the colonization of England by the Romans. I mean, it becomes part of the Roman Empire. And the Romans were in England for 400 years. I mean, I think a lot of us, especially for those of us who are not, British and we're not thinking about this, we just think, oh yeah, the Romans were in Britain for a second. I mean, 400 years. That's twice as long as the United States has existed. The Romans were there. And again, cities like London began essentially as a Roman city. And even today, if you get a chance to go to London, you can still see the Roman walls and parts of it. And I was shocked the first time I went and realized how much of London, of Roman London, you can still see at least evidence of it and vestiges of. And in fact, the idea of dividing England and Scotland, I mean, there's always been distinct peoples and even the geography changes when you get into Scotland. But it was really the Romans. The Romans conquered much of what is today England. But as you're getting into the north, into Scotland, I mean, they do have excursions there. There are some evidence of the Romans in Scotland. I mean, they were there. But even today, you can still see more, it's more earthworks, ditches and things like that. But you can still see evidence of the Romans in Scotland. But essentially, the Romans kind of ended up giving up on Scotland, and they built a wall. Then they built a second wall. But the main one was Hadrian's Wall, which it's really all in England today, but was kind of the first boundary between what is now England and Scotland. Although there was a further north wall, Antonines Wall. But again, kind of the start of the real divide, I think, between and the mental idea of there's two distinct areas, because it is just one island. But again, you can still see some of the evidence of these the sentry systems and such as part of Hadrian's Wall here. Um, Again, you go to other parts of England like Bath, and again, really incredible Roman ruins that are still pretty well there. Um, And even, some of these myths about like King Arthur, there's always been rumors that maybe this is, some evidence maybe of resistance to the Romans and things like that. I know one of the recent movies of King Arthur kind of postulates this. Um, so again, the Romans were there for over 400 years before the Roman Empire slowly retreats and they do abandon Britain. And then you have, another period of just the locals there, and then, in Scotland starting to develop and stuff. And then you do get another invasion or migration of peoples, and that's these Germanic peoples, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And of course, this is where we get the word England from, Angleland. And when we talk about Anglo-Americans or Anglo-Saxon culture, this is where we're getting that from. And what I'm talking right this second, this Germanic language I am using, again, I mean, it's not the original version, but this is coming from these Germanic peoples. What I'm speaking now is a modern derivation of the language that these people brought with them. And again, we're not seeing a complete population replacement, which again is supposed to be the story. It's supposed to be these guys came in, pushed the Celtic people out up into Scotland and Wales and over to Ireland, and they completely replaced the people of England. And again, DNA, we know, and archaeologically, we know that's not the case. There are people moving in, and we see their DNA there. But think more the leadership is changing. These are now new leaders. But of course, they're also the language did ultimately take hold. But we do see these Germanic peoples moving in um, and establishing kingdoms, these Saxon kingdoms and such. The evidence of these guys is pretty amazing. One of the coolest sites is Sutton Hoo, which is the site in Suffolk, England. It's actually, I think it's two ships ultimately that was found buried there, probably of at least one king. And first found in 1939. In fact, there are still excavations today. It is one of the most amazing collections of artifacts, especially of this era. And if you go to British Museum, you can see a lot of this. This is a reconstruction of one of the helmets that they found. The original one was like in pieces, but this is a reconstruction. Just amazing artwork and such. And so again, we're talking, we're thinking of these kind of barbaric kind of peoples, and this is amazing stuff that we're seeing here. And And they kind of settle in and they meld in with the local peoples. And then couple centuries later, we get another group of people. And this one really, I think, is more of an invasion type. These Scandinavians coming in that we refer to as Vikings. Again, we're talking peoples from what is now Norway and Sweden and even northern Germany, and what is now Iceland, coming in and again also having a major impact on the island of Britain. We first really see this in 793, but really a little bit later is when you really get the settlement and the development of basically Viking kingdoms here. Again, England, we see a lot of this evidence in Scotland, especially on the western coast, and they're here for a while. I mean, this is another major group coming in and melding with the locals. And actually, the DNA shows a lot of evidence, and their influence was much more widespread, I think, than historians originally thought. And then you get yet another group in 1066. This is the Norman invasion, which oddly enough, Norman does come from Northmen, so it initially referred to the Vikings who settled that part of France, although by this point they're French. So this is a French invasion. And again, think more of all of these, really think more leadership changing. Because both with the Vikings and with the Normans, I mean, the Normans are speaking French, but yet England still speaks English. So the language didn't change. The populations didn't really change. It's the leadership that's changing. But there is melding with the local people as well. And ironically, or just interestingly, if you're interested in British, English kings and queens, most books about them always start with William the Conqueror, the first of the Normans that come in. There's plenty of kings and queens before, but those are from those earlier Saxon kingdoms and Viking kingdoms and the Romans and. Um, it is once you get to this point, it is a cleaner history because even today Charles III traces his throne at least maybe not his genetics but his throne all the way back to William the Conqueror. And what you see here is part of a huge, there's William the Conqueror there, who, is considered quote unquote the first English king. Obviously, there were ones before him, but this is, kind of the beginning of England proper, if you will. There's no July 4th for England or Scotland in the way there is for us, but this is kind of the beginning of what we begin to really refer to as England and then about the same time, what we refer to now as Scotland. Um, we do see a very distinct style of castle and fortifications that what we refer to as Norman. They're really kind of these classic old school castles. But anyway, this tapestry tells, that what you're seeing in these images are, was created to kind of tell the story of this invasion, if you will, and what happened and the establishment of the kingdoms and all that. And there is I mean, there is a real development of England. A lot of these cathedrals are being developed and some of these incredible features. And then things do slow down with the Black Plague, and but the populations do slowly recover, and for the most part, as far as people coming in, that's kind of it. I mean, England is always, basically has always prided itself that it's never been invaded since William the Conqueror. But there's one other event that I wanted to bring up, because again, the whole purpose of this is, really simplistic and really quite lousy, attempt at British history. This is not, this is just doing this quick and dirty tonight. But what I am interested in, again, is this idea of the development of the ethnicity and identity of, of England that, again, ultimately will become Anglo-Americans. And so I did want to talk about one more event. I mean, there's probably plenty I could bring up, but I did want to bring up one more event, and it's a political event. So this is, 200 years after the Norman invasion and involves a guy named King John. King John. So you may know that name. If you've maybe as a kid you read up on Robin Hood, which probably was not really a real figure. There's lots of debates, kind of like King Arthur. There's always been debates: are these real or fully mythical? Although pretty quickly people do talk about a Robin Hood. There were celebrations for Robin Hood in the 13 and 1400s, things like that. But um, whether or not he's real or not, we're all pretty familiar with these stories. There's been movies in the last couple of decades. growing up as a kid of the 70s, when I think of Robin Hood, I do think of the Disney movie. And so the character of King John from Robin Hood is a real person. So when I think of King John, I have to be honest, this is my image. Although probably the best version, if you don't mind old movies, is the old Errol Flynn version of Robin Hood with Claude Rains playing King John. Although a fun one was, it's not a good movie, but from the early, I think literally 91, there was a Kevin Costner version of Robin Hood, and Snape, Alan Rickman played King John. Again, not a good movie, but Alan Rickman basically just said, I'm going to just play it my way. So he's playing a comedy while the rest of it's a bad action film. Anyway, so of course, John was the brother of King Richard. Richard was fighting in the Crusades, and but eventually Richard dies, and so John, who was kind of, he was the regent, if you will, he was the substitute king, does become the king of England at this point. And just very quickly, King John, this is what I'm supposed to say. Okay, in Robin Hood, he's a bad king, but in real life, he wasn't that bad. Actually, he was still pretty bad. Treated his spouses terrible. Had people killed. He started a war with France that England couldn't win. That's not good. England's in debt. He also angers the Catholic Church. This is still when, most of the major countries of Europe were tied in with the Universal Church, the Catholic Church. And at some point, the Pope excommunicates England because of his actions. And one thing that you forget, kings at this point, they're not the all-powerful monarchs that we think of, later. Um, I mean, really, when I think when a lot of people think of a king or queen, somebody who could snap their fingers and anything happens, we're thinking the monarchs again of the 15 and 1600s. The King Louis the 13th or 14th or King Henry the 8th and stuff. This is long before then. These kings were so much more vulnerable. They really didn't have a huge administration. They were, I mean, if you read your Shakespeare, from Richard the Second, through the Henrys and, up to Richard the Third. I mean, they're constantly fighting for their lives just to stay on the throne. They're killing each other. Scotland was even worse with this. I mean, almost every king, it feels like, in Scotland was named James and got murdered. And so they really needed, really had to constantly make sure they had support of the barons, the landowners, right? I mean, that was their real power. And by this point, King John had alienated so much of that power base because when he's raising taxes and raising armies, it's really the barons doing this, the landowners who are then making the people on their land do this. And so after, a lot of his actions, there was an uprising against King John. A lot of the landowners, the barons were like, we're done. And they were fighting King John at a place called Runnymede, which is where this monument you see here is. Um, John does indeed agree to some of their demands, and they draw up a document, and he agrees to it. He then immediately reneges on it once he is away. He keeps fighting, but he dies less than a year after this, and this is 1215. And so, literally, less than a year after this, he dies. His son takes over, and he reaffirms that commitment, and he sticks to it. So because he wants to be king. And this is referred to this agreement, which there are a few copies today that exist. The main one's in the British Library. I think one is at Lincoln Cathedral, and at least for a while, one was in the Library of Congress. I don't know if it lives there forever, if it was just there, but I've seen the one in the British Library. And it's, Magna Carta just means big document, a big piece of paper. And a lot of it is very interesting because it's very specific to 1215. It's all their grievances. I mean, there's stuff about fishing in there and such. But, for those of you who are focusing more on law and government, I mean, this is hugely important. I mean, this is kind of the foundation of a lot of modern law, including here in the U.S. That monument was actually put up by the American Bar, the American Lawyer Association. Um, but again and again, this is kind of I mean, it basically said that even the king is not above the law, and we do see start of what we've evolved into parliament and the whole idea of civil rights and taxation was. But for me, what a lot of this is really about is um, English. Even though it was limited when it first began, but this is the start of this idea of English people having rights because they're English. And you can see the beginning of a real English identity. I mean, if you think about the history, there's all these different groups and different invasions, but there is coalescing a real sense of Englishness. And the Magna Carta is one of those things that does do this. And so to me, that is kind of the final step in this I mean, or the beginning of the coalition of this idea of Englishness. Again, the English are really the core culture of the U.S., even though not all of us are English in our heritage. But it is the language we speak. It's still the largest ethnic group. It is, the founding fathers were English. Our form of government is essentially an English form of government. So again, just because we're not maybe English physically, it is still the core culture, plus all the other cultures that have come here as well, of course. So again, kind of recap, you have, these early peoples, the Britons, the Picts, some of these other groups. You also have these Romans coming in for a while, then you have these Angles and Saxons, then you have the Vikings, then you have these French Normans. But by 1600, and the reason I use 1600 is because, again, 600 years after the Norman invasion, this is when England begins to colonize the New World, 1607 being the first permanent English colony in the New World, right? So by that point, you know, even though you have all these different peoples that are coming over, but by 1600 there is this strong sense of we are English. And really, in many ways, they had a stronger sense of that identity than many other European groups. Some of that is because they are an island. Some of that is a byproduct of the Protestant Reformation. They were part of this universal church. Now they have their own church and identity. But nonetheless, there is this strong sense of Englishness, even though they're divided by class and money. They do have a sense of they are English themselves. It is an English ethnicity, if you will. Even though, again, when we use the term Anglo-American, we are usually including Scottish and Welsh, and really, to be honest, we're Western Europeans. It is often what we mean when we say Anglo-Americans or Anglo-Saxon culture. Um, and of course, the term WASP, which is not used much in the South, but in other parts of the country, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So, most WASPs in the South have never heard the term. They don't realize that's a term for them. And lastly, this will be the last slide for this section. This brings us up where I wanted to stop because it's right at the time of colonization. That'll be the next step. And that will also bring in Africa there too. But again, you could really describe English society by 1600s as a kind of a cohesive society. It's a Christian society, um, but primarily a Protestant Christian society. In fact, you could even get more specific. It's primarily the Church of England. Um, it is a deferential society, meaning there is a sense of you show deference to your upper classes. There is a sense of English civil rights that you have as a member of the English society. I would also argue that because England was kind of the dominant power in Britain, that there was a sense of political and cultural kind of superiority. Again, because they do have the sense of being more in charge and not being invaded. Um, Again, they have their own church. By 1600s, they've been pretty successful militarily at that point. And I have this phrase, "start of race?" question mark. I'll explain that in the next part. Because again, that what I talked about early on, that idea of Celtic versus Anglo. I mean, English are really thinking by 1600s, England's they have this idea that they are looking at the Highlanders and they're looking at the Irish and the Welsh, and to them, they are seeing. they're beginning to see them as different peoples. And so they're not using the term race yet, but there is a what could be considered the beginnings of a racial identity. So they're forming ideas of race even within what we now call the United Kingdom, if you will. Okay, that's enough for today. I think I've gone over the time I meant this to do. So, all right, we'll pick it up when we meet in class.